let me turn to our illustrious guests today, starting with Debora Diniz. Debora is a professor at the University of Brasília and a researcher at ANIS, Institute of Bioethics. She's a visiting researcher at the Center for Latin American Caribbean Studies at Brown, and she works on bioethics, feminism, human rights, and health. Thanks for being here today, Debora. Our next guest is Rafael Gonçalves. He's professor at PUC-Rio in Rio de Janeiro, and his work investigates urban socio-environmental issues in connection with different forms of social resistance. Next, we have Yanilda Maria González, who is assistant professor of public policy at Harvard Kennedy School, ex-colleague of ours here at the University of Chicago. It's great to see Yanilda back at Center for Latin American Studies. Her research focuses on policing, state violence, and citizenship and democracy, examining how race, class, and other forms of inequality shape these processes. And finally, Isabela Kalil is professor at the Fundação Escola de Sociologia e Política, São Paulo, FEPESP. Her research examines the far right and the phenomenon of Bolsonarismo in Brazil, focusing on conservatism, neoliberalism, and anti-gender policies, protests, public demonstrations, digital activism, and the internet. So with no further ado, Debora, why don't you get us started, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Benjamin, and thank you to my colleagues here today. It's really a pleasure to be here to discuss the role of the social movements in Brazilian democracy. The organizers suggested us that we share our thoughts about the role of the social movements and the construction and expansion of Brazilian democracy, but as well the impact of institutional conceptions of democracy on the fulfillment of these movements' goals. And I will concentrate my 10 minutes conversation on the feminist movements and particularly on the abortion rights movements. And I want to explore the question of our conversation through the recent history of how feminist reproductive rights and justice movements have been successfully reframing abortion legalization as a debt of democracy to women in Latin America, and how this process, particularly in Brazil, raises common yet persistently wrong questions about the role of constitutional courts in regards to democratic institutional arrangements. I intend to do so by addressing two main questions. The first one is if the courts are a legitimate space for advancing abortion rights, and secondly, if there is a right timing to courts to decide on issues considered, and I'm using really quotations, sensitive issues like abortion rights. These questions have been playing out in the background of many, if not most, of the abortion legalization advances made in the region, and particularly in Brazil over the last few years. But it's striking that although Brazil was initially at the forefront of constitutional courts advancing abortion rights, while several countries of Latin America, such as Colombia and Mexico, have recently taken key steps in this direction, Brazil has gone the opposite way, as the Supreme Court has been shying away from the protagonistic role it had in the 20s, and I would say at the beginning of the last decade, the 2010. In the last 2 decades, we have witnessed an intense increase in litigation challenging abortion laws in Latin American countries. Brazil was at the forefront of this movement when the so-called anencephaly case arrived at the Supreme Court in 2004, and it took 8 years to be decided. And last week marked the 10th year anniversary of the court's decision. The anencephaly case, that is a very specific exception of the penal code when the fetus will not be viable, demanded a new exception to the criminal prohibition against abortion. And as I said, a very narrow exception. Since then, the court has deliberated on abortion rights-related issues through several different cases, and the most significant one was the stem cell research case, in which the court ruled on the constitutionality of the law authorizing research with the stem cells. All of these cases had a strong participation of the feminist reproductive rights movement. In 2017, the court was present with a new case, this one asking for the full decriminalization of abortion in the first 12 weeks of pregnancy. A year later, with a record number of organizations asking to participate in the political and the constitutional debate, the name is Amici Curi, we had a public hearing with 57 speakers. So technically speaking, the case is ready to be ruled on. In terms of the timing of the court, and it's really a concept that is really, it's a well-known among judges and courts around Latin America, that there is a timing for the court to take a decision. We have been waiting already 5 years for this case. There is an intriguing question here. Why has the Brazilian Supreme Court adopted a slower pace compared to other Latin American countries, and even when formally called to rule on abortion judicial review? Why is this timing of the decision so drawn out and so slow? 8 years for a narrow exception, and now 5 years and counting for the abortion decriminalization case. And as a Brazilian, I'm very much immersed in the dynamics of this moment in our country's democracy, in the outright and persistent challenges to democratic norms and institutions. But even that, I would like to offer a possible explanation for the timing of the court, for the reason behind the time of the waiting. And it's my view that the court is not ruling on the abortion decriminalization case because of the fear that is circulating in the political space. So I'm open if you disagree and we can talk about it, but the fact is that the constitutional courts are a legitimate space for judicial review of abortion law. Colombia was one of the most restrictive settings in the world until 2006, when the court first ruled on reinterpreting the law to allow abortion in specific exceptions. After the recent decision from the Constitutional Court, alongside with Canada, South Korea, and Mexico, Colombia is now among the countries that have decriminalized abortion via judicial review. I can imagine that some of you are now thinking about what is happening, including in the US, where several states are restricting abortion access, and wondering if these Latin American courts' decisions will also eventually be defied or undermined. These calls for judicial review or legislative review of abortion regulations are a permanent element of the struggle on abortion rights. They are not fueled by the controversy of whether courts or the parliaments are legitimate spaces, but rather they are fueled by the moral discourse and forces that seek to control people's reproductive autonomy and integrity. 2 weeks ago, we heard the former president and now the candidate, President Lula, in an interview saying that, and I'm quoting him, abortion should be decriminalized as it is a public health issue. The quote provoked a national debate about whether abortion should even be a priority question, considering the urgency of defeating Bolsonaro in the next national election. A few days later, his first interview, Lula, he framed himself saying, again, I'm quoting him, that I'm Lula, so he is personally against abortion, but he still understands how abortion is a public health issue. Meanwhile, I was responding to dozens of journalists with the same question. Is this the right moment to discuss abortion decriminalization in Brazil? And my response is yes. The time is now. And the Brazilian Supreme Court is the proper democratic institution to answer the question, given that there's a pending constitutional case that was brought to the case by the feminist movement. And my response commonly generates a second question that we can leave to the debate about the legitimacy of judicial review of abortion regulations, which in turn involves discussing the institutional conception of democracy in Brazil. But I leave this question to our debate, and I hope that I have used lesser than 10 minutes.
Wow, that was fantastic. I mean, straight to the point and right on time. Thank you very much, Debora. That was very interesting and food for thought. Let's just move right on and turn to Rafael Gonçalves. Rafael, you've got the floor.
I'm grateful for the Center for Latin American Studies invitation to share here some of my experience. Thanks a lot. My name is Rafael Soares Gonçalves. I'm a professor of social work department at Católica University of Rio. My work as an urban historian has been focused specifically on the favelas and other informal areas of Rio de Janeiro, as well as similar urban space in other Latin American cities. It's an honor for me to share this table with my colleagues here. Before introducing the central issues of my talk, I would like to apologize for my English. I don't speak it well, but I promise to do my best. Because of this, I prefer to read my presentation, which will be strict, less than the 15 minutes. The history of social movement in Brazil is marked by a process of constant struggle and resistance. In the 1917s and 18s, still during the civil military dictatorship, several social urban movements were reconfigured and they began raising new issues and proposals. New forms of demanding rights emerging from politicization of daily life. These movements were led by residents of the peripheries, favelas, and working class suburbs to fight against social inequalities that have shaped our history. Grassroots social movements have added new characters of the Brazilian historical scene, which Edersada called then collective subject, a collectivity where an identity is elaborated and practiced are organized through which its members intended to defend their interests and express their wills, constitution themselves in these struggles. In this way, the social movements, led by the working class, introduce a new question pointing towards a politics formed from everyday life, as well as indicate a new conception of politics, created from the direct intervention of the subject involved. For certain groups and grassroots organizations, the focus was no longer exclusively on the issues of equal rights, but also on the question of social inequality, which primarily affects groups based on gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and location of residence. Social inequalities and precarious life conditions that affect the discriminated groups are nothing new. In this case, the novelty was the way the issues were understood and transformed into demands, and the groups make the clans, which constitutes new forms of grassroots organizations. Over the last decades, much of the world has been struggling through political, social, cultural, economic, and pandemic-related crises. This has influenced social issues and directly affected the agendas, the function, the format of civil society organizations. Even with this scenario, several grassroots organizations have been reconfiguring and strengthening a political movement led by people who unite based on a certain type of clan or according to their belong to a social geographic territory. This peripheral collective subject act in social organization located in working class communities and are focused on various aspects of social inequality. In this sense, for example, Tiarajau highlights certain elements that are common in the formation of popular subject, the subjection to condition, formation of subjectivities, shared cultural codes, consciousness of belonging, and political action. Therefore, these are attributes that differentiate and characterize some of these collective subjects, and that reinforce the condition of protagonists of their own history, of experience multiple forms of oppression, claiming rights on behalf of their territory, and the condition marked by subalternity and that compose popular organization, such as the Favelas Museum, for example, grassroots college entrance exam and practice course, pré-vestibular populares in Portuguese, local community NGOs, or different kinds of collectives. In this context, it's worth reinforcing some current issues in Brazil, and especially in Rio de Janeiro. The following points are entirely interconnected. So first of all, the growth of right-wing extremism and the partial absence of democratic forces within the working class spaces. So trade unions, progressive parties, and even progressive section, for example, of the Catholic Church, are no longer as present in the grassroots spaces. Two, the strong growth of a business ethic. The neoliberal perspective of entrepreneurship has gained strength, especially in working class spaces. This has occurred despite the strength of collective approach, such as the self-construction of houses, or even in the organization of carnival groups with the enormous collective, social, and political work done by Sunday school during the entire year, for example. Perhaps the significant increase in social inequalities and poverty in recent years in Brazil will bring new forms of mobilization. Three, the presence of a network of evangelical church with robust local support. Internet social networks do a huge job for the conservative force nowadays, but we cannot forget that there is a local network that's extremely active. We need to understand that such church do tangible work for the residents, mutual help, mediation with the local gangs, building a kind of local sociability. So I think that we need to do more work inside this network. Four, the complex relationship of local criminal groups and the strong imposition of the law of silence. I heard from many residents that they don't want to work in the neighborhood association because of pressure from local criminal groups. Their activities involve taxing the residents' daily practice. Thus, the criminal groups impose a rigid control of the population's daily lives and impose a limit of collective forms of mobilization. Some of these groups, everybody knows, are even deeply connected to the established power until the Brazilian nowadays. Five, the loss of the state's legitimacy in this working class space due to the extreme violence of police force and also due to the violence stemming from public intervention in general, especially those that restart favela eradication policies. State violence increased during the last few years against Afro-Brazilians and the inhabitants of favelas and urban peripheries. The idea of we can do it by ourselves is relevant, but it endangers the collective mobilization for access to public resources. We no longer see mobilization, for example, for favela urbanization projects. People are afraid of the state entering their favela. Mobilization are always on a particular issues, to fix a broken pipe, the risk of a hillside collapsing, or to repair a street light. So to finish, the understanding of this space as a problem to be solved and that distorting the understanding of this reality, compromising public policy, and perpetuate specific forms of intervention. The negative representations associated with the favelas have evidently blocked question about the historical reflection about this place, and worse, have silenced the memory of their residents. Negative representation about this space and their inhabitants influence the ability of this place to make history, despite the richness and complexity of the social practice of their residents. In this context, the idea that these spaces are precarious and temporary is reproduced, which has even influenced the terms used by state intervention in this place. The Portuguese from Brazil is perhaps the only language that uses the expression favela urbanization, for example. there is an implicit message that the favelas are not urban, but some favelas emerged before some of the formal areas of the cities. Who did the urbanizing? Many social movements in favelas, for example, strive to build archives and organize local museums in a political effort. This has become even clearer with the recent increase in university attendance among favelas residents since the period that the political left was in power. This creates an important dialogue. Many leaders have gone through the university and used the tools acquired in higher education. And the presence of this student has brought a renewal of the Brazilian universities that are historically elitist and white. Belong with the social movements, popular suburbs, peripheries, and favelas have become positivized forms of classification. Integration does not pass by erasing the memory of this space. It's no longer a matter of classifying them by the absence of attributes to be considered part of the city, but of valuing the potentiality of this space. In a way, perhaps, the new urban utopias look back to the past. The right to the city for informal areas pass first of all through the right to the past. There are important mobilization experience, but I'm not sure if they can really impact the daily lives of enough of the population in peripheral neighborhoods in Brazil and in Rio. We know that this year will be extremely difficult in Brazil. The question is if we will have a cup against Brazilian democracy. Perhaps the question is more about when it will happen. And I think that the answer for the Brazilian peripheries will be extremely important for Brazilian democracy. Thank you.
Thanks, Rafael. That was great. Yanilda, are you with us?
Yes. I'm here.
Great.
Can
Take it away.
So first, I just want to thank Professor Ben Lessing and Isabel, Tomás, and the other students for putting together this space for us to think together about the role of social movements in shaping and advancing Brazilian democracy. In this particular presentation, I want to share some of my work on mobilization by family members of victims of state violence in Brazil, of police violence in particular, which I think is one of the most robust social movements in the world of folks who have been directly affected by state violence. And so this question about policing, police violence has been a really a central one at the forefront in many global contexts. I think in recent years, many of us will recall seeing impressive, large-scale and enduring mobilizations against police violence. In the case of the United States, of course, following the killing of George Floyd, in Chile, as part of their estallido social, in which the police became a central grievance. In Colombia, and their paro nacional, in which again policing also became a central grievance. But even outside of the Americas, we've seen protests. We saw enduring protests. Some of the largest protests, for example, in Nigerian history, happened as part of the NSARS movement, where folks were protesting against a violent and unaccountable unit of the police known as SARS. So this is really a key question, right, to sort of where ordinary citizens, activists, victims, survivors have been calling to our attention the importance of police violence for democracy. And so I think in my research, this has been one of the most persistent questions, right, is this relationship between police violence and democracy. And I wanted to just highlight two voices of leaders of social movements that I encountered in my fieldwork who really put this question in a really compelling way. Right, so the one is Debora Maria da Silva, who many of you may know her work. She lost her son to police violence in São Paulo, Brazil, and she challenged former President Dilma Rousseff to question whether the dictatorship had really ended, given the large numbers of citizens that had been killed by police in democracy. And similarly, Nora Cortiñas, one of Argentina's famed mothers of Plaza de Mayo, similarly told me that while the military went back to the barracks when the dictatorship ended, the police have had continuity, enjoying carte blanche to engage in violence. And this continued prevalence of police violence and abuses in Latin America, despite the return to democracy, has really been something that's been a huge puzzle to academics as well. Sort of over the decades, many scholars have highlighted, right, why democratic societies would tolerate such police systems, right? And this is exactly the question that these social movements have been calling upon us to address. So just wanted to give a bit of an overview on this contradiction between the persistence of state violence despite the return to democracy. So Latin America, as many of you might know, is the world's most violent region, with a significant proportion of that violence coming from the state itself. So although the region is known for the brutal dictatorships of the past, a less well-known feature of contemporary democratic Latin America is the remarkably high rates of violence exerted by state institutions against its own citizens. For instance, the Brazilian police killed 5,000 people in 2017, and that number has gone up since then, which is about 5 times as many as the 1,000 or so as the 18,000 police forces throughout the United States combined. In places like Venezuela, the numbers are even more stark. And curbing the state violence, however, has been a particular challenge, poses a particular challenge in democracies because this violence often has considerable public support and can sometimes be reinforced by elections and participatory institutions, as my work and other people's work has also shown. And this means that state violence in democracy paradoxically has a degree of legitimacy that violence under authoritarian periods does not. And one final point that I wanted to mention about this tensions and contradictions between the persistence of state violence in democracy is this a particular difference between violence in democratic Latin America versus previous authoritarian eras, namely the social characteristics of its victims. So while dictatorships tended to target university students, activists, and other middle class sectors, the victims of the region's democratic states tend to come from disadvantaged sectors. What Brazilians call the 3 Ps, preto, pobre, periférico, Black, poor, and from the urban periphery. And so these are the contradictory conditions in which these social movements are taking place. I wanted to situate a little bit the discussion just in the context of Sao Paulo and think about what state violence has looked like there to see what are people mobilizing against. And I'll try to go through this as quickly as possible because somehow I have already been talking for 5 minutes and I'm not sure how that happened. So first, in the state of Sao Paulo, police killings in recent years, this chart I see has, I included an outdated chart here, but essentially that police killings have not only been rising in recent years, but they also have come to constitute an increasing proportion out of the total number of all homicides. Another characteristic of police violence in Brazil and in Sao Paulo, sort of as we've discussed, is its highly racialized nature, right? They disproportionately target Black citizens, with studies over several decades confirming these disparities in all sorts of police activities, from stops to arrests to police killings. And so I'll just, we know that these racial disparities not only exist at the state level in Sao Paulo, but they exist at the national level in Brazil, where we see that 3/4 of all victims of police violence are Black versus about 55 or so percent of the population. And this has only become more acute in the era of Bolsonaro, because he literally put police violence on the agenda, on the Democratic agenda when he ran for office, explicitly defending state violence, right? Making campaign promises essentially that, if making claims like what I have sort of posted up on this slide, right, that it was necessary to do the work that the military regime did not do, which is to kill some 30,000 people. In addition to saying that if a police officer that doesn't shoot anyone and gets shot at is not a police officer. There was a clear sense that he was putting state violence on the agenda, and as we know, he was elected. And so under these conditions, how do we understand the causes, the ways that mobilization happens, and the consequences of mobilization by the family members of victims of state violence in democracy. So I just wanted to share some of the early findings from my more recent projects on this question. And so one of the things that I found in my research is that in contrast to what a lot of the literature, at least the US-based literature on political participation, which finds that things like stigma and negative messages from the state tend to demobilize people, I actually find that stigma is actually an important mobilizing force for family members of victims, particularly mothers of victims of police violence. So over the course of my research, I spoke with several mothers who said that the stigmatization of their child was a key reason for becoming publicly engaged. For instance, one mother whose son was killed by police always reaffirms her son's identity as a worker. She does this to counter the stigma that are attached to many victims of police violence, saying that they might have been bandidos. She often emphasizes, my son was a worker. He was a simple street cleaner. Just to give you another example, another woman that I spoke with during my research, her son was killed by police at 17 years old. And she says that he was likely stopped because he had Diniz, sneakers that cost 1,000 reais. She said that police discriminate against poor Black youth in the periferias, assuming that if they have something nice, it must be stolen or obtained through illicit means. She said that her son had Diniz reais that he was able to buy because he had been saving for many months. She said that police sees it as ostentando and treats these youth as criminals. But her son, she insists, worked, studied, and saved until he was able to buy those sneakers. So as we see, a lot of the stigma that the victims of police violence are forced to endure, it's actually one of the things that drives many mothers to become politically active in these social movements. And so in addition to mobilizing to counter these stigmatizing narratives, the mothers also make use of what I call intersectional collective action frames that center their intersectional identities predominantly as Black women who are low income and from urban peripheries. These characteristics become central to their organizing and their understanding of why their children were killed. One striking aspect is that through the tragedy of losing their children to state violence, many mothers come to recognize themselves as Black, as this quote that I have on the slide suggests, right? So one of the women that I spoke with in my research said, I never considered myself a Black woman. It was only after my son died that I realized it. I didn't consider myself Black or white or Indian. I didn't know anything about that. And so we see that another driver of mobilization is this understanding that it is their identities as Black people, as people from low-income backgrounds, people from urban peripheries, that is driving this state violence. I'm trying to cut my comments short because I know I'm coming up on my time. So then maybe one of the things that I'll just mention here is what is specifically, or I think one thing that I find especially notable and important for us to talk about in this context about democracy is that we see this mobilization taking place explicitly by using the language of democracy and citizenship to make rights-based demands upon the state and challenge state practices. And it is precisely this type of mobilization that I call resilient citizenship. So in the face of the unrelenting politics of death of these states, the mothers seek to, as one of the mothers I work with says, give birth to a new Brazil. This new Brazil is one in which Black youth can have access to the basic protections of citizenship. So as the mother who lost her 17-year-old son to police violence put it, her struggle for justice is so that one day her daughter's children will be able to, quote, walk around the periferia and dress however they like, without fear of being stopped by the police. And they'll say, my grandmother fought for this. Another compelling statement of this was made by an organizer in Salvador who greeted me and the mother of a victim in her home and told us of another tragedy in her mostly Black, mostly poor community. A young man from the neighborhood had entered the drug trade and ended up killing a police officer. The police ended up invading his family's home and killed his brother in front of his mother. The mother then said that she wanted to take revenge against the officer who killed her son, but our host told us that she encouraged the mother to organize with the other mothers instead, warning that, quote, there is no getting revenge on the state. All we can do is organize ourselves. And so one thing that I think is really important here is why I call this resilient citizenship, is that in a lot of the literature on resilience, it treats the concept as a set of policy interventions that the state can undertake, or that foundations or other entities can undertake to try to change citizens and communities to make them more able to adapt to adverse circumstances. Resilient citizenship, in contrast, is a process by which individuals vulnerable to the negation of citizenship come to challenge the state socially and politically, making these rights-based claims for justice, reparations, and reform. So in fact, they are trying to change the state in order to reduce risk and adversity created by the state itself. And so this is really at the core of this mobilization by these social movements, and why I think it's so relevant to consider sort of their role in democracy. One thing that I wanted to just mention in closing, because I see that I only have 1 minute left, is kind of the effect of this mobilization on institutions. And so I wanted to just quote one journalist that I interviewed. If I can find it in my many notes, I over prepared for this. But that essentially that these social movements are working not only for, these activists are working not only for the specific case of their own victims, but that they are actively working to shape institutions and how they operate. And so one thing that I wanted to say, as I mentioned, sort of citing the journalists, is sort of that a lot of the target of their mobilization is also shaping social discourses and media discourses. And so one of the things that I wanted to just mention is sort of how young journalists are being reshaped by this mobilization, and then changing how they report the news. So one young journalist that I spoke to told me about why they prioritize interviewing mothers when writing about cases of police killings. And so she says, quote, "I don't think that including the mother's voice is going to change the world from one day to the next, but I think that it's the beginning of a change in perspective and public opinion regarding police violence. I think it's a way of accessing the imaginary and the heart of the reader by creating empathy. It's much easier to have empathy when you think about a mother just like you talking about the loss of her son." And so I argue that it's this particular sort of special place that our societies have for motherhood that enables this mobilization to reach farther beyond sort of one specific case to really try to make these changes in social and political institutions and advance this cause of democratization. So I'll stop there because I know I'm over my time, but thank you again so much for this space to think about these questions.
Thank you, Yanilda. And no worries, you're right on time, and I know you had that was a great deal of material that was highly relevant that I'm sure we'll want to bring into the discussion going forward. So thank you very much for that. And Isabela, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here in this panel. I'm going to read my presentation, and my name is Isabela Kalil. I'm an anthropologist, and I work at Escola, Sociologia e Política de São Paulo. So the title of my presentation is The Anti-Democratic Wave in Brazilian Social Movements, and I'm going to read this on the screen. In the last decade, Brazil has undergone an anti-democratic conservative wave that culminated in the election of President Jair Bolsonaro in 2018. His campaign promises included the encouragement of violence by civilian hands and widespread access to firearms. His platform explored an anti-corruption agenda that allowed him to attack multiple political parties and left-wing leaders while promoting conservative Christian moral values materialized in his campaign slogan, God, Fatherland, and Family. After being elected, Bolsonaro implemented an anti-democratic project that includes environmental devastation and attacks on the rights of indigenous peoples, intolerance against Afro-Brazilian religions, the reduction of civil rights, the increase of inequalities and violence in both cities and the countryside, attacks against politics of gender, sexuality, and reproductive health, and the historical revisionism demonstrated more pointedly by the celebration of the 1964 military coup in a process that relativizes torture and authoritarianism. With the COVID-19 pandemic, as I have discussed in previous works, under the Bolsonaro government, the formulation of public policy was guided by far-right conspiracy theories that at first denied the existence of the virus and then raised doubts about the safety of vaccines. This process resulted in major delays in the numerous refusals by the federal government to combat the disease. As the work of other Brazilian researchers shows in a study carried out by the NGO Conectas, Bolsonaro deliberately acted to increase contamination in Brazil by seeking herd immunity, based on the already scientifically refuted thesis that contamination would be more effective than vaccines. Regarding the topic of this panel, the performance of social movements, what we have seen is an overreaching process of criminalization. And in this regard, there's a statement by the president himself in response to criticism by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, in 2019, that help us understand his strategy. I quote, I didn't harm or threaten Brazilian democracy, or as Bachelet lied about me, I'm not reducing Brazil's democratic space. I'm only reducing the democratic space of the left. There is no doubt about it. Contrary to what may appear in a first impression, the scenario is more complex than simply saying there is an ongoing process to criminalize social movements in Brazil. Or, in other words, I quote, reduce the democratic space of the left. Social movements played a key role in country's redemocratization process in the 1980s, after more than 2 decades of military dictatorship. In this process, movements for agrarian reform stand out in the countryside, while the right to vote in direct and democratic election was the focus in urban spaces. Additionally, the struggle for racial and gender equality and the recognition of indigenous rights also took a central role at the time. Despite the important history of social movements struggles and its aligned with the history of democracy in Brazil, the last decade was marked by the emergence of an anti-democratic social movements based on an ultra-liberal and anti-corruption agenda to attack state institutions and their regulatory and redistributive public policies aimed at combating inequality and poverty. These movements began to brand themselves as a political renewal or representatives of the new politics as a counterpoint to the established system, described by them as the old politics. The slogan used by these social movements, liberal in economics and conservative in morality, expresses the union between an agenda of dismantling the state, seen by these new actors as an outdated, inefficient, and corrupt entity, with an agenda by ultra-conservative groups who see public schools as a place of danger in face of relatively recent progressive movements that brought to the classroom topics such as gender, sex education, identity politics, civil rights, racism, and a critical perspective on history about slavery and the dictatorship. This slogan of liberal in economics and conservative in morality is analogous to how Wendy Brown has critically described in the US politics a novel articulation of neoliberalism and new conservatism. In her words, this relationship juxtaposes a rationality of deregulation and a morality, neoliberalism in the case, and another rationality of regulation and morality, new conservatism. Her view, which is also useful to analyze Brazilian society, is that even when, in theory, this rationality appeared not to have many affinities, their juxtaposition enhances the productions of subjects that, indifferent to the truth, political freedom, and equality, tend to easily consent with anti-democratic positions. Empirically, the union of these forces materialized in civil society in the form of the cidadão de bem. Here, it becomes essential to mention that the literal translation of this term in Portuguese, cidadão de bem, corresponds to the good citizen, which it's also the name of a publication in circulation during the 30s in support of Ku Klux Klan. The figure of the good citizen captures the complex ways in which society and power work. This figure has also captured anti-system tendencies, those who are against all parties or against all politicians or against everything and everyone. And then I'm quoting. And later, those who criticized corruption in financial, moral, and religion terms. The good citizen was gradually crystallized as the figure radically distinguished from categories, groups, and real people connected to the left-wing thinking and politics, as well as previous democratic social movements in Brazil history. Although this political figure is not entirely new in Brazilian society, since 2013, it has been deliberated, mobilized by the emerging right, learning formations to distinguish between those who participate in peaceful demonstrations and those involved in violent protests. This seen as violent protests. This distinction was also intensively exploited by the mainstream media at the time as a justification for supporting certain types of demonstrations and social movements while repudiating others. It's based on the easily reproducible idea that there are appropriated forms for participation in public space, in contrast to inappropriated ones. By 2016, the term's meaning was significantly refined as it got entangled with the expanding anti-corruption discourse. The good citizen, previously used to denote an appropriated mode of conduct both in private and civic life, was initially resignified to differentiate modalities of protests, violent versus peaceful, and later invoked to accuse certain politicians of being corrupt, in contrast to others who were good or non-corrupt. The term was gradually come to designate those who, apart from having a correct individual conduct and knowing how to behave in demonstrations, is also sharply distinguished from those who support corrupt people. After 2016, the good citizen had already become synonymous with social and political actors who differ from those perceived or portrayed as communistas, petistas, or leftists, seen as supporters of corruption, as well as those who don't work, an expression used to designate populations seen as welfare dependent. The term now implies a very specific meaning of private and public personhood in a mode of belonging and behaving in society, or more broadly speaking, the nation. To understand how the discourse against corruption has been grounded on the figure of the good citizen, It's also necessary to chart various definitions attributed to the word corruption. These are by and large based on the long-standing triad of God, fatherland, and family, which was put into circulation by an ultra-conservative Catholic group right before the 1964 military coup, but which quite significantly since 2015 has once again become a motto repeated by a wider range of both secular and religious formations. In this formula, corruption is viewed as something inherent to governments or public management, but which would be absent or hardly present in private companies or large corporations. Within this narrow frame, the eventual corruption of private sector is singularly portrayed as a consequence of public corruption. However, among us Bolsonaro supporters, the term corruption is polysemic. It also means a pervasive disorder of customs and values that are supposedly jeopardizing the family order. Under this denotation, the current anti-corruption discourse targets private and moral conducts, such as sexual orientation and religious beliefs. In another, but still related register, corruption also has come to signify the reduction of individual freedoms and the role of the family in the formation of citizenship. In that sense, the state becomes corrupt when in the school environment, it addresses matters that are seen as the exclusive responsibility of the family, such as ideological and political beliefs and education on sexual matters. Finally, another floating meaning of corruption is what the right-wing actors portray as a confusion between rights and privileges. Their list features people who they see as enjoying many rights and not performing their duties, including those who benefit from social programs directed towards the poorest populations, beneficiaries of affirmative actions policies, and the programs that support cultural production. This perspective is what anchors the violent criticism that Bolsonaro's supporters deploy against Bolsa Família, for example. Bolsa Família is the social welfare program that provides financial aid to poor Brazilian families, or affirmative actions in universities. The combination of all these factors has resulted in a landscape transformed by actors in civil society who restricted the rights of those not considered good citizens, but privileged by state, such as indigenous populations, Black people, poor women, rural workers, LGBTQIA+ people, teachers, etc. These actors seek to defend the rights of good citizens and reduce what they consider to be the democratic space of the left, which in this context is a category of accusation used against any position defending human rights, civil rights, and environmental preservation policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Isabella. That was great. I want to thank all the speakers. You've presented four distinct and very fascinating, provocative sets of ideas, sets of empirical facts, a lot of the sort of empirical and social reality of what it's been like to be involved in social movements and involved in democratic change in Brazil over the last 4 years along a number of different fronts, abortion rights, sort of urban favela community organization, overlapping in some ways and streaming into the crisis of police violence and how citizens respond to it, violence which is overwhelmingly visited on, as Yanilda put it, on Black community, peripheral community, and impoverished communities. And finally, the troubling and fascinating issue of how the right has mobilized and in many ways co-opted language and is itself, deeply rooted in a kind of social movement tactics and praxis that in many ways have worked to its advantage in an age of social media and sort of fake news and other issues, which we've explored really throughout this entire series. So with that, I want to turn to our panel of graduate students who organized this event and who now are going to have some comments and interpretive comments and some questions for our panelists. Isabella, do you want to go first, or?
Sure, I can go first. Thank you all so much. This was a very important and timely discussion. So my question is a more general question that we were developing collectively throughout the panel, and it stems from a debate that reemerges every electoral year, it seems, which is about the calculation that citizens and mainly candidates are supposed to do in order to sort of balance, so to speak, more radical demands that are considered leftist, so reproductive rights or abolition, for instance, and a more pragmatic approach to the electoral process that supposedly would not ostracize conservative voters. So for instance, when Lula mentioned abortion as a public health issue, he was heavily criticized because that might ostracize conservative voters, right, in the election this year. And at the same time, candidates that mobilize agendas such as public security, such as Bolsonaro himself and the governor of Rio de Janeiro, they ended up being elected. So my question is, why does the left need to bend to electoral pragmatism while the right uses its own radical demands as electoral fodder? So is that a thing that we should, how should we approach this issue, which is, I think, something that comes up in everybody's mind. Thank you so much. And it is for all of you.
Great. Do you want to, Gabriel, do you want to maybe ask your questions as well? And then we can just go through the whole panel as a whole, so we don't have to do that twice.
Sure. Thank you, everyone. The presentations were great. Thank you for being here with us. I have a question that's specific to Rafael. You were commenting on this sort of neoliberal entrepreneurship model, this new sort of kind of mobilization that is not explicitly political or not political at all, and how it in a way fosters an alienation of favela communities from a mobilization towards legislative change and administrative change in the state apparatus. And so I had a question that's related to that. Can we filter from or see in this neoliberal aspect of self-construction and quote unquote problem solving an update of forms of self-governance and informal practices that we have seen in favelas for so long? Or in other words, by looking at these quote unquote entrepreneurial efforts as primarily a neoliberal phenomenon rather than another chapter in the history of favelas challenging conceptions of formal governance, are we inevitably pulled back to the formalization ethos in projecting that onto favela communities?
Great. Why don't we go back to the panel if you get, we can just kind of, I'd also encourage panelists to respond to one another's presentations as well. So you also have an opportunity to, if you felt that the themes that were brought up by the other panelists were, you want to comment on or tie into the things you were trying to say as well. I think you should all feel free to do that. So why don't we go back through and, if you can all take 5 minutes or so to respond, that would be great. Debora, would you like to get us started?
Yeah, sure. I think that Isabela raised a similar question that Lucas Almendra put in the chat. That is about how do we define our political agenda in such a sensitive moment, right? That we are in our in Brazilian democracy, and Isabela described in a way of saying this pragmatistic agenda of not speaking about some sensitive issues like abortion or gay rights. But my question is, if it's really a problem just for the right that will mobilize the fanaticism of the right, or is something that is so embedded in Brazilian democracy, in Brazilian society, in the way that we do politics that is about the patriarchal, racist society that is embedded in the way that we do politics, in the way that we frame the conversation about inequality. So we can talk about inequality in a political campaign that is really a hot issue, but with the condition that is no gender, no race, and while discussing class, social class and social inequality. So my point is that two comments about it. Putting those issues at the forefront of any conversation is really talking about people's lives. It's not ignoring that we live inequality from our bodies, and it's also challenging the way that we do political campaigns. That is not ignoring, that is not silencing about issues that are really concrete for women's lives. And my point is that this is not just a difficult issue for the far-right fanaticists. It's really an issue for leftists, for people who call themselves progressive politicians. So my point is that there's no more difficult issue than discuss police brutality, than discuss corruption. And we have been talking about it. So the point is not that we are calling the attention from the Bolsonaristas and to make their lives easier discussing issues like abortion, but it's on the other way around. So I'm not saying that the moment is now and how we are going to talk. My point is that we should not be silent about it. And the history has shown us what are the consequences of not talking about it.
Great, thank you. Rafael, would you like to?
Yeah, you try to answer I think it's Gabriel, no? Gabriel questions. Look, it's a very huge question, so perhaps I need to have more 15 minutes, but I will try to do in 2 minutes. But first of all, I don't try to say that the informal and informal areas, it's complicated to see as a dualism. So for example, the informal rental markets in the favelas always exist. So it's not a question or a situation that you can observe nowadays. But what I want to say that there are the points that I mentioned are very connected. Nowadays, there are a very strong, for example, informal rental market that it's sometimes far from the self-construction process that a family tried to build a second floor for her family, for her daughter, I don't know. It's a really market, and it's really connect with some criminal groups inside the favelas. For example, as the militias inside the favelas, or the drug dealers, because nowadays the difference between militia and drug dealers is not so far, so it's more or less the same. So what I want to say that around these markets, we need to say it's a market, it's a rental market, but it's always a drug market. It's a market to tax, for example, the gas, to tax the alternative transportation inside the favela. So it's a market that touches a different situation in the daily life. What I want to say that there are a lot of people inside the favelas that need to live. So it's not belong to the criminal groups, but they take part of this situation sometimes. For example, the people that construct a house that work in this way, perhaps it will be contracted by a militia that. So what I want to say that it's really complicated, this kind of situation. Entrepreneurship, it starts to, I can say, to kill some collective situation, collective space And for example, the law of the silence, it's the same thing. It's really, really difficult from the group. So it's normal, as Yanilda said, I saw the same in the favelas movement, that the woman has a very strong presence. But sometimes it's really dangerous. The people are afraid to talk about their daily life, to change some situation, because there are a very strong pressure around them to impose a way to live in these areas. So what I want to say that these different groups inside the favelas impose sometimes, for example, the evangelical church, it's the same way. There are a very strong idea, it's the prosperity theology that is very strong in this way. And it's really interesting for the people, less to help each other, but to have money. So, or perhaps to have a very strong and small communities with their evangelical church. So I think that there are very changement in the way to the movement works. It's really different. For example, in the last years, with a very strong presence of the Catholic Church, it was different. It was very paternalist, but it's much more organic. The way to organize and to work with it. We try to work with all community together. So I think there are different situations, and for me, I think that the left party, the democratic force, they have, I don't know, they have a really difficult to talk with this kind of expression, this kind of ideas. It's the same, for example, how do we talk the labor rights, for example, for a urban Uber driver nowadays? It's really complicated because now they are their self-boss. So how to explain that they are a company behind them that explore them? So it's really complicated. So I don't think so, to finish, that there are a process to formalization the favelas. I don't think that the people are fighting for the formalization, because I think the informality take part in this kind of informal market. It's something that it's important in this organization. So what I want to say that the informality is not a bad thing, much and the less it's a good thing. I think that there are a way to organize the group inside that sometimes it's very nice, it's a solution for these people, but sometimes it could be used by some groups, for example, nowadays with the militia that start to construct several buildings in the favelas, and we don't know how to block and to impose a limit in this construction.
Great, thank you very much, Rafael. Yanilda.
I would just say, with respect to Isabela's point, is that one of the things that I think about a lot when it comes to police violence is kind of what are sort of about the distribution of public opinion with respect to these issues. In other words, why it's so difficult to build a consensus that we don't want violent police forces, that we, right, like these shouldn't be things that are controversial, that we don't want police forces to exercise violence without accountability, that we don't want police forces to act outside the bounds of the law, et cetera, et cetera. So these are kind of some of the characteristics that I define as democratic policing. And so one of the things that I think about in my work is sort of how public opinion is actually very divided when it comes to police violence, that there's actually very little in the way of consensus when it comes to how people feel about the police. So something that I find is kind of that in unequal societies, you're going to have divided opinions about how people think about the police. And so one thing that I cite public opinion data in my book about how, it's a pretty consistent finding since the 90s up until today that, sort of slightly less than half of the population might feel that, the police are behaving too violently, but that there's always something between 10 and 20% of the population that believe that the police are not violent enough. And so it's something that it becomes a real question about sort of what's going on in that middle, and sort of why is it that's so difficult so often to get that middle to join the ranks of what I call the ranks of critics, the ranks that believe that we ought to reform police and make police adhere to the limits of the law. But that's the real challenge of kind of our unequal democracies, that those folks in the middle don't see themselves as being affected by police violence, right? They don't see, for sort of by a lot of these issues, they maybe don't see themselves as being affected by some of the other progressive demands that Isabela was talking about. And so they end up sitting on the sidelines and being neutral, while those that are in the side of believing that in this case the police are not violent enough, or calling for other more reactionary types of policies, are allowed to be as active as they want, and sort of because they are linked to other more powerful actors, such as in this case the police and other institutions. But that kind of distribution of opinions is why I think that the kind of tricky politics of why the left or those who are pro police reform, pro human rights, pro civil rights, have a much more difficult time advocating for their positions versus those on the right, or those who favor more violent police, et cetera. It's that tricky politics of getting those folks in the middle to become active on issues that they don't see themselves as being directly affected by. At least that's how I see it relating to sort of my work on police violence.
Great. Troubling, but great. So Isabela, would you like to respond to some of the questions so far?
Not exactly. I'd like to say something about related to something that Debora said. Recently we conducted interviews with people in the periphery, and that was interesting because they are against police brutality. They understand the importance of programs against domestic violence, gender equality, but they refuse what they call isms, meaning like feminism. It's like they understand that it's an important agenda, but they refuse feminism or any ism, like communism, feminism, meaning I think it's a way to translate any form of political participation in by civil society, organized with a specific agenda, or related or in dialogue with political parties, institutions. And I think it's a paradox, because it's like we have in this conservative, anti-democratic social movements, a hiding agenda. They say they don't have ideology. They say they don't have an agenda. They say it's a spontaneous process. And in the end of the day, of course, we know that it's not spontaneous. They have money. They have a specific agenda, but they make to believe that they are spontaneous. It's like something that naturally appears in the society. And I think it's a paradox, because I think during the elections, we have to face this problem in the say, listen, society is organized in different ways. Of course, we have, and it's really important to have space to this spontaneous phenomenon, but in the end of the day, they are using this idea to hide a specific agenda with no transparency.
Great. I guess I want to just reflect back some thoughts about this idea. Not only the risk of, so there's so many important agendas for mobilization. And those agendas are all sort of, not all, but increasingly sort of triggers for the conservative movements, for the alt-right. And so just even trying to mobilize on those agendas, feeds this cauldron of, the left-wing conspiracy and the sort of, the deep state, or whatever way it's being characterized, even when they're just very legitimate bottom-up democratic movements. And I thought, Isabela's intervention really fascinating, where, that's exactly right. The alt-right very consciously saying, no, we want to restrict the space for certain kinds of democratic movement, right? Certain kinds of democratic change. So that in and of itself is a problem. I was thinking about Debora's presentation as well, and just reflecting on it's often, throughout this series, it's often been helpful to compare and contrast the experience in the US. And I think the experience of abortion, particularly in the U.S. right now, it's very troubling to see, Roe versus Wade being nearly overturned. We're on the verge of going back to sort of, pre-Roe versus Wade, to a reality from the 1970s. But one distinction I've often heard made, and I wonder what you guys think about this, is that abortion was a certain kind of issue. Other social issues, progressive victories, are different in the following respect. When abortion became legal in the United States, you started having legal abortion clinics, and you started having legal abortions, and those became the target for mobilizing anti-abortion efforts. They were public. You could go to these clinics. It became this very public fact that in many ways crystallized the anti-abortion movement. Whereas the illegality of abortion in Latin America for so many years, had made it so there was no, you couldn't, anti-abortion efforts could never point to something. This is happening legally. People are getting, so it had this kind of effect of creating its own backlash. People have often contrasted that to, for example, gay marriage, which, was hard fought, took a long time to achieve, took, far too long to achieve. But once it was achieved, some would argue, you got sort of, relatively positive social facts, these weddings and couples, and more sort of, everyone could people started having relatives or friends who were married, in gay marriages. And so as a result, acceptance seemed to go up over time. And that, it was much harder to mobilize an anti or homophobic agenda or an anti-gay rights agenda, because the simple fact of happily married couples wasn't something that, made people upset or it didn't make a broad swath of the population upset. Now, you may or may not think that's the case. You may say now that the alt-right is certainly gearing up now to go after gay marriage. And so it's not clear that distinction is valid. But I just wonder if this is a valid thing to think about in terms of Brazilian politics. Are there issues where, because there certainly are issues like abortion, where progressive and democratic victories have turned into points of mobilization for the alt-right. And I think probably the most important and really sad one is the social mobility and the decreasing in inequality that occurred under the first, at least the first two terms of the PT government. Massive decrease in inequality, one of the largest decreases in inequality in Latin American history. And it seems to have provoked a kind of mobilization on the alt-right around those very facts, right? Oh, the empregada who went to Disney. Oh, the people in the airport who used to only be used to have to take the bus. And so there was kind of open mobilization around the very success, the very social fact created by the success of previous democratic gains. I'm wondering if there are other arenas, though, that might be a little bit more like, gay marriage or other social issues where those successes don't generate flashpoints for the kind of conservative mobilization that Isabela pointed out. Sorry to be so long-winded to get that thought out, but if anyone would like to respond. And let me just also throw out a question to Yanilda and to Isabela from Sonia Hotimsky, who asks about if we could comment a little bit more about the moral capital of motherhood. It points out that mothers were also very important in the social movements of creches in the 70s and 80s, and asks Isabela about the association between the concept of the good citizen and the private mode of personhood. So we're running kind of low on time. If any of you guys, but we can easily go for the next 5 minutes. If anybody on the panel would like to respond, you can just feel free. You can unmute yourself and jump in.
So I think that one thing that I would just say is that absolutely the concept of this moral capital of motherhood, this is nothing new, and sort of mobilization by mothers, in particular Black mothers, in the case of the US, for example, was very prominent during the 1960s around the issue of welfare reform, for example. So this is kind of the kind of an exploration around a similar type of mobilization transferred to another issue area, and exploring sort of how that plays out in the case of Latin America and Brazil. But I think maybe to Ben's point, I think that one thing that can speak to this moral capital of motherhood I think it relates to the quote from the journalist that I included in my presentation. And the reason I wanted to include it was precisely because of this concept of empathy. And the ability to kind of try, those sort of folks in the middle that I mentioned, who sort of don't see themselves as being affected by a lot of these problems, a lot of, social marginalization, of state violence, of sort of other forms of exclusion. This connection through motherhood, of sort of seeing, someone who's a mother just like me, or somebody that I can relate to because that reminds me of my mother. It's something that this journalist, sort of one thing that she was saying, that maybe this is something that can help change public opinion. Maybe this is something that can kind of universalize, a particular issue in a way that other groups or other symbols maybe can't. And so maybe sort of, to Ben's point, the idea of families and marriage and weddings with respect to, gay marriage is something that helped to shift public opinion on something that maybe would have otherwise been more controversial. And so I think that that's kind of the real power of in this particular case of mobilization by mothers, is sort of using that role of that universal, somewhat universally respected role of motherhood to try to shift opinion, to create empathy on an issue area that is otherwise pretty controversial.
Thanks, Yanilda. Debora, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I would give the same example as you gave about the United States on gay rights. It's similar in Brazil. We basically had a Supreme Court decision, and everybody was expecting what people used to call backlash. That is a concept that is good to sometime that we have to unpack how it's wrong against progressive movements, and life is going. So there's no, strong pushback. And what is in common in the United States and in Brazil about gay rights? We're talking mostly about men at the forefront of making change. And when we go to abortion, we have something that is really touching the patriarchal norms about social and biological reproduction of life. But what Chile, Argentina, Mexico, and Colombia showed us, and Chile is a very good example, that even with a far right candidate at the final end, the new president was not able to talk about abortion, but put in the new constitution. Argentina, millions in the streets, and it was a promise from the campaign. Colombia decriminalized abortion weeks before the election. So my point is that it's something about the way that we understand a political campaign, and in case of Brazil, that is mostly about men in their 50s and 60s, that what is sensitive and about the issue.
Fantastic, absolutely. Anyone else want to make a quick comment? Because we are at time, but there's, we're happy to go over for a few minutes if anyone else wants to.
1 minute, just to agree with Isabela, when I think that sometimes the question isn't about the ideas, but the form how we communicate the ideas. So I think that some progressive forces and movements are far from the peripheries. I don't know, I think we needed to listen and dialogue much more and try to understand what happened in these areas. Sometimes I think that we are very far, and there are very beautiful and fantastic things that pass inside in this area. So I think that we need to increase and dialogue with them. And I think that the universities at space very important to open from the peripheries.
Isabela, do you want to close us out?
Yeah. Sonia Rutinsky asked about how this figure, the citizen of good citizen, can be expanded to a personal space. And I think the key element is this triad: God, fatherland, and family. And it's plastic enough because in a certain ways can mean everything or nothing. So it's really plastic, and they can adapt to that. That's the tricky thing. And defending family, I think, is one of the most important things. So it doesn't matter if you are using guns to defend your family and expressing violence against the others, But in a way, in the end of the day, they believe they are defending family. So we think that's the tricky thing, because it's contradictory, because sometimes they can defend the use of violence in order to defend God, their fatherland and family in a very plastic way.
All of these topics are, fascinating. We could talk all day, but we do have to stop. I really want to, I want to thank our fantastic panelists for their contributions and their thoughtful engagement with one another. And again, I want to thank our graduate student organizers for making this happen and for engaging with our panelists. And I want to thank all of you for coming and spending the afternoon with us today at class. And I do want to encourage you all to sign up for the class newsletter if you're not already receiving it, and check out our other events that are planned throughout the quarter, and in particular, the upcoming session on Outlook for Brazilian Democracy on May 18th. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you soon.